Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Paul Byer. I'm the founder and director here at the TomTom Foundation in Charlottesville, and we're thrilled that you can join us today for the third installment in this impactful and inspiring conversation series with the United Way here in Charlottesville called Exposed: The Inequities Revealed by COVID-19. Today's conversation is an incredibly important one. It looks at affordable housing across the country, but specifically through the lens of an innovative model that has been worked on and developed here in Charlottesville with the residents that are most directly impacted. We're thrilled to host this with the United Way. This was something that was initially part of our spring summit and festival when we were back doing in-person events. And it's been wonderful to work with the United Way to continue this partnership and to continue this series at a time when it really couldn't be more necessary and more needed. So I wanted to just mention that there will be 4 more of these sessions. Come back and join us Wednesdays at 4 p.m. We're going to be continuing to do these. And I also wanted to note that this is pay what you can. So we're so thrilled to partner with the United Way, and we're especially excited to use this platform as an opportunity to raise awareness and funds for the United Way's Resilience Fund that is bringing needed resources to families here in Charlottesville and in the greater region that have been impacted by COVID-19. So if you've enjoyed or inspired by today's talk, I hope you will consider making that donation and supporting the United Way's work. So I wanted to introduce now Ravi Rispetto, my friend, and the executive director here of the United Way in Charlottesville. And Ravi, again, thank you for your partnership and the tremendous energy and creativity you brought to this series. And take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, we're just incredibly appreciative to have the platform and partnership with Paul and the TomTom Festival, doing great work here in our community. And I want to thank each of you for being with us today. As a community-based organization, we're really only as valuable as the positive impact that we have on our neighbors and on a personal and structural level. So we're defined by and we're judged on our ability to create stronger, more equitable, and more resilient communities through our partnerships and programs. And really, like any organization, we spend time processing and planning how we can best affect positive change here in our community with our competencies and our resources. But it's really our responsiveness to crisis and ability to be agile and creative in how we connect to community members and how we dispense knowledge and resources that's the true test of our commitment to our mission here. And with COVID-19 exposing many of the inequities that communities of color have experienced in healthcare, financial stability, and wealth generation, it's more important than ever than to have these public and potentially uncomfortable conversations about the context and these qualities that we see in our community. It's vital that we bring in the experts such that we have today, community members and people doing the work day in and day out into these conversations together to share perspectives and grow on one another's diverse points of view. You know, we don't have all the answers at the United Way, and these aren't issues that will be solved in short order, but to make demonstrable progress around gaps in equity and access that have been compounded generation after generation, we have to be more inclusive in how we speak about and actionably address issues of equity here in our community. And we're excited that you've joined us today, and we hope you'll be an active participant in the session. And we have 4 more remaining, as Paul mentioned. And we'd love for you to bring what you learned here today back to your homes, to your offices, dinner tables, social circles, and ultimately be a part of the movement and walk the walk with us and join us. So thank you again for being here. Just a couple logistics. Today's session will be broken into 3 parts. First, Charlene Green and Sunshine Mathon will give a 30 to 40-minute presentation describing Piedmont Housing Alliance's unprecedented initiative to redefine how we view community through income and cultural integration in Friendship Court. We will then send you into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes to discuss their presentation with other members of the community that are on the call today. And if you've not done so already, please enable the video and microphone icons in the top left corner of your screen so you are able to participate when the time comes. And we'll close with a Q&A portion with our speakers. Also, please note that the chat function in the bottom right corner of the screen, we will ask that you direct your questions there, as well as encourage you to interact with your fellow attendees there throughout the session. And we'll start with you posting where you're coming from today, where you live. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the PHA Executive Director, Sunshine Mathon, and also Charlene Green, their new Deputy Director. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Ravi, and welcome everyone for participating in this panel discussion. Ravi mentioned about how if you want to have an impact on a community, there are a number of things that you can do. And I think from the work that I've been doing, one of the first things that I think is important when you're talking about transforming a neighborhood, transforming any kind of space, is to acknowledge the history, and not just certain parts of the history that we typically have been used to. You know, the history that we're typically fed at school regarding, you know, the Civil War, slavery, the history that from a very specific perspective that tends to leave out in huge ways the rest of the story. And so I think if you're really sincere about transforming a space, especially as it relates to equity in any kind of way, one of the first things you need to do is understand the history of that space. And that's something that I've had the opportunity through the work that I've done for the past, my 30 years of living in Charlottesville, is being able to examine that history, especially the racial and ethnic history of this particular area. And I would say in any space that you're in, you want to know what that history is all about. And I think when I do my presentations on the racial and ethnic history of Charlottesville, there are a lot of pieces of information that I share with the folks who participate in those sessions, who have never had any idea of the kinds of things that have taken place, whether it's the more hidden pieces of history that happen to be negative, or the amazingly positive things about the history, again, that has been hidden. And it has a really huge impact, I think, on the perspective that people have about who has contributed to the creation and the building of that community and particular neighborhoods, and who has been responsible, what things have been responsible for the destruction of particular areas. And so, so as a jumping off point, because you could go way, way back when you're talking about the history of Virginia as a colony, and then as it turns into a state, going back to 1619. And if you're not familiar with that history, I encourage you to check out the 1619 Project through the New York Times. Amazingly enlightening, and I think it just sheds a light on American history in a way that we just don't get in our schools. In the Charlottesville and Albemarle area, it was primarily, a lot of folks don't know this, it was primarily populated by Blacks. We know this to be true from definitely the 1860 census, but even prior to that, and clearly we're in the era of, in that time of slavery, the predominant population of Blacks were enslaved. There were some freed Blacks. By the 1860 census, you're talking about 53.3% of the population of Albemarle and Charlottesville being of enslaved Blacks, and there were a little more than 400 who were freed Blacks. And that was the population of the area that we're in. Most of those folks were on plantations in private homes, but they populated the city and the county in this area. And then as we move through the end of the Civil War into emancipation, because of the manumission laws, you had a number of people who settled in this area, but you also had some who decided it wasn't safe to stay in Virginia and they left. But you still had a majority of the population in this area, in our neighborhoods, who were Black, and they were on farms in some of the outlying area of Albemarle, but you also had some folks starting to settle within the city of Charlottesville. Over the course of the next 100 years, from 1860, in a very, very organized way, you had, through Jim Crow and through legalized discrimination, you had the majority of those Blacks who were populating this area being pushed out. If you're from the Central Virginia area, you may have heard about the community of Vinegar Hill. Vinegar Hill is a very popular name in this area because of the attention and all of the reports and history written about that particular neighborhood, because it was decimated in the 1960s. But there were a number of neighborhoods that were also in existence that were populated by Blacks that were also decimated. And so you had the neighborhood of Pearl Street, which was over where we currently have the Albemarle County office building. It was Lane High School. It was built, that area, that neighborhood was decimated. The city pushed those folks out, the Black folks out in that particular neighborhood, because they needed to build another high school, another white high school in Charlottesville. A Midway High School had become too small, and so they needed another space. And so some of the folks who were youngsters back in the day, who still live today in Charlottesville, remember when they had to leave that area. And it was a very vibrant African-American neighborhood within Charlottesville, where the city said, we're taking this by eminent domain. Another neighborhood that folks aren't familiar with is Gospel Hill. It's over by the hospital. This area was, and the homes in that area were bought up by the university in order to expand the hospital. And so again, you have another African-American neighborhood that is taken by an institution in order to benefit the people in that space. Another neighborhood that people aren't familiar with, or no, I take that back. The neighborhood that people are familiar with that I mentioned before is Vinegar Hill. That was actually a neighborhood that was, a referendum was created to take that particular neighborhood. You had the Housing Act from 1927 that was amended in 1939 that basically allowed for urban renewal. And it allowed for the creation of redevelopment authorities. And so in 1954, the city of Charlottesville decided that like the 14 other area localities in Virginia, they were going to create a housing authority, and so they did. That housing authority then, in meeting with the city council at that time and the Chamber of Commerce, decided that they were going to target a neighborhood, which happened to be Vinegar Hill, which happened to be populated by African Americans, which had been populated by free Blacks and Irish, who were working on the railroad originally, but became a neighborhood that was populated by African Americans. And and decided that they were going to focus on the slum, the shacks that did not have indoor plumbing and running water. All of the images that were in the paper, all of the propaganda that was trying to convince the community that this was a neighborhood that needed to be taken, was focused on the housing that didn't look good, that promoted Charlottesville as a neighborhood that had poor people that were not living well, that needed to be addressed. And they completely ignored the nice houses and the businesses that were in that area that were essential to the folks who lived in that space, and all of the folks in the surrounding area of Charlottesville and Albemarle who depended on the businesses and the community, the activity in that community. So a referendum was created in 1960. It passed, not by much, but it passed. And the intention was to take the almost 600 people and between 30 and 40 businesses out of that area to financially benefit the city of Charlottesville. And the creation of the first public housing units were then where the poorest of the folks, about 114 families were moved in, or 114 people were moved into the housing units over what we now know as West Haven. There are still a few people who originally were living in Vinegar Hill who now still live in West Haven. And then you have, which was happening, even though you had covenants that were included in a lot of the neighborhoods that were being created around Charlottesville and Albemarle that said you cannot sell this home or sell this property to a Negro, which then had the segregated neighborhoods of African Americans cropping up as early as the 1800s. And one of the other neighborhoods that doesn't also get talked about a lot is the Friendship Court neighborhood, which was then known as the Garrett neighborhood because of Garrett Street, 6th Street, Ware Street. All in that area, you had a lot of predominantly African American folks living in that space, with some businesses that employed some of the blacks who lived in that area. And again, as a part of the whole urban renewal initiative that the city was taking, folks in those homes were also pushed out. Not by referendum, they were just pushed out. And so there's a history, and not just in Charlottesville and the state of Virginia, but all over the country, of African American neighborhoods, especially when it is found that they are on property that is desired by a local government, by a development that, or a developer that has a lot of money who is able to start pushing people out, or institutions like a university. These things have been happening all over the country. They happened here, and it had a huge impact on the population that started back in the 1860s with African Americans taking up 15.3% of the population in this area, to now what we now have is maybe in a combination of the city, which is about 18 to 19% African American, and the Albemarle County, which is about 8 to 9% African American. And so that's where we are with how people have either been pushed out, or because they couldn't find a place to start a business or to buy a home, they left. They left in search of fulfilling their hopes and dreams in other places. And so if we don't acknowledge that that has been the history of how progress has happened in a locality, then it makes it difficult to start to address the needs and concerns of the people who still live in that area today, especially when the huge concern is affordable housing. And we're not basing that history and taking that into consideration for the strategies that we're developing in the creation of places that people can afford to live, whether if they're renting or hopefully seeking to own. And so in the process of acknowledging that racism still exists today within those institutions, we need to talk about the lack of access to finances. When in the Charlottesville area, the Charlottesville region, there are anywhere from 2,500 to 3,000 families that don't make enough money to afford to live. And we're talking about as much as $38,000 a year to afford a home in this area. And because they're not making enough, that links to the inadequate employment that we know exists for people who are trying to just survive. And then and I'm just touching the tip of the head of the needle of the nail on this, because you're also talking about the zoning that is in place that also negatively impacts the vitality of a neighborhood. When you can't have, when you have food deserts, when there's a lack of transportation, adequate transportation, that gets people in a timely fashion to their place of employment, and they have to take 2 or 3 buses and make those transfers in order to get to a job that only pays them maybe $9 an hour. So there are lots of dots that get connected that have an impact on why we're having this discussion about affordable housing. And we're not doing our due diligence if we don't look back at where this all came from and how that still impacts what we're dealing with today. And so I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Sunshine, and he can tell you more about what we are trying to do at Friendship Court and those efforts in order to improve affordable housing for folks in this area.
Thank you, Charlene. That was fantastic, and that was a perfect introduction to what we're trying to do at Friendship Court. And normally I start a discussion like this with a much shorter version of that same, what Charlene just discussed, because I think it's critically important that anytime we're talking about the future, just as Charlene said in the beginning of her presentation, we have to reference how we got here in the first place. So if you look at this sort of sequence of timeline for Friendship Court in the 1960s and before that, as Charlene mentioned, it was the Garrett neighborhood that was home to and occupied by businesses predominantly owned by and lived in by the Black community in Charlottesville at the time. As part of urban renewal, just like in Vinegar Hill, Friendship Court, or Garrett neighborhood at that time was essentially forcibly moved to make way ultimately for what became what we now know as Friendship Court in the late 70s. One thing I want to clarify, and I'm going to try to go a little bit back and forth between sort of big picture, but also some minutia of detail. I think it's important for people to know the details as well as understand how it all fits into the bigger picture. So just one common misconception about Friendship Court is that it's public housing. And I want to dispel that misconception because not that there's a negative association necessarily, but just because there is a difference. So Friendship Court was developed privately by a private owner in the late 70s. But it does get, and this is where the misconception comes from, it does get a HUD subsidy called a Section 8 subsidy that provides a rental subsidy for the residents who live at Friendship Court. And so what that means on a practical level is that residents who live at Friendship Court will always pay 30% of their income towards their rent. And so if the rent goes up, if their income goes up, the rent goes up. If their income goes down, the rent goes down. And that HUD subsidy makes up the difference to allow us to operate the property. So Friendship Court existed for 30-something years before, in the early 2000s, it was at risk for being lost to the community as a whole as affordable housing. The private owner at the time was considering putting it up for sale, and that would have likely meant that it would have been redeveloped for some other purpose other than affordable housing. And those 150 families who depended on the subsidy for rent for Friendship Court would have lost their homes. So kind of in a partnership together, Piedmont Housing Alliance came together with a national nonprofit based out of DC, the National Housing Coalition, National Housing Trust. They partnered with Piedmont Housing Alliance with some support from the city to purchase Friendship Court to preserve it over time. And then in the mid to late teens, just 3, 4, 5 years ago, the concept of redeveloping Friendship Court emerged. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So one of the things that I want to highlight is that, and I want to address this from sort of an asset-based conversation. There is tremendous history and lived expertise and passion that the residents of Friendship Court have about their community. And one of the most important endeavors that kicked off this process of considering redevelopment was the establishing of an advisory committee. So the 9 residents you see there at the top of the screen were elected by their neighbors to represent them through the redevelopment process. And then there were 6 additional members from the at-large Charlottesville community there you see on the bottom of your screen to bring in some additional expertise and insight as well. The fact that it's a large majority resident members is critical to ensure that their voices are predominant. And another aspect of this that I think is really critical to acknowledge is that they are, we engage them in the same way that we would engage any other expert in a field. They bring their lived experience and the expertise of their connections to the community and understanding what the community's desires and aspirations are. And so because we like any expert, we pay them, the residents of the Friendship Court Advisory Committee also get a stipend for their participation to honor and acknowledge that expertise. They have done extraordinary work over the last 3 or 4 years in partnership with the staff at Piedmont Housing Alliance and the architecture firm that we're working with, Grimm & Parker Architects, to design, and also, actually, I want to highlight this too. So one of the other core partners here is Liz Ogbu, and I don't have her picture or name up, but Liz is an architect consultant based out of the DC area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and she brings a community engagement expertise and a deep empathy and understanding of how to provide a framework for residents to have authentic voice in a process. So all of us together have worked over the last 3 or 4 years, led by the Resident Advisory Committee, towards a vision for their community. These are the key reasons why redevelopment is important from a resident perspective. I'm not going to go into detail to all of these just because of the limited time here. Part of it has to do with the outdated buildings. Part of it has to do with the fact that I've heard this commonly said that if you have a Garrett Street address, people know, they presume who you are. They make assumptions about where you come from and who your family is. And so part of the idea of redeveloping is to begin to erode that stigma over time. Another reason for development from the residents' perspective is the need for more affordable housing. We all know that Charlottesville is in the middle, and just like many, if not every community across the country, is struggling with affordable housing. One pretty startling statistic is that there is not a single county anywhere in the entire country, of the thousands and thousands of counties, there's not a single one where somebody working a minimum wage job can afford a market rate apartment. And Charlottesville, the condition is more dire than most. So we need more affordable housing in the community as a whole, and the opportunity for redeveloping Friendship Court introduces the ability to add some in a really phenomenal location in the heart of the city. The Friendship Court has been, the residents at Friendship Court have felt and been economically and socially isolated from the rest of the community. So Charlottesville proper has a median household income of close to $90,000 a year. And the median income at Friendship Court is close to $14,000 a year. And that's most of the households at Friendship Court have working jobs, and they work on a regular basis. So these are folks who are struggling to make ends meet, largely single moms who are doing their best to provide for their families in very difficult circumstances. And then there's the other two key pieces there, the adding the ladder of affordability and disrupting cycles of generational poverty. I've heard this again over and over from residents, that people often feel stuck at Friendship Court once they get there. Ideally, I've heard that many folks would prefer it to feel like a stepping stone or a ladder or a safety net when times are tough, but then there ideally should be pathways out so that they can move into a home that they won't want to be able to pass down to their children, or they can move into a career ladder that feels like it has a pathway forward to a decent wage in the long run. But again, a pretty startling statistic is that Charlottesville happens to be in the bottom 3% nationwide for opportunities for upward economic mobility. So what that means is that 97% of the communities in the country, if you are born poor in those communities, you have a better chance of breaking out of poverty than you do in Charlottesville. The work that the advisory committee has done over the last 3 years, as I mentioned, is pretty extraordinary. We have met over and over and over again to consider a huge variety of priorities that the residents want to lift up through this redevelopment process, and then digging into the details about how you turn priorities and aspirations into real infrastructure and real housing units and roads and parking and open space and gardens, all of which have to be balanced against each other in some capacity. And I do at this moment want to highlight that there's no really roadmap out there. The work that we're doing at Friendship Court is almost unique, meaning that we are doing a redevelopment with residents not just being able to provide their input, but fundamentally being co-designers of their future community. And we have the beauty of having a little bit of open space on the site that allows us to do the redevelopment in a phased manner. And this became one of the first and foremost priorities of the residents, to do a phased redevelopment so that we could build in the open space first, and then sequence building newer units over time as we built the first phase, move some folks in, and then sequence it. And I'll describe that a little bit more in detail. But the bottom line is what that means, what that translates to, is that there is going to be zero displacement of the residents through the redevelopment process, which again is extremely rare. But there is no roadmap out there for how to do a redevelopment of a community, engaging the residents as co-designers, letting them giving them the power to set the priorities that are the most important that we are going to fulfill on. And part of one of those priorities is, from their perspective, is an income integrated model. And there's almost no precedent for how to do that well. But I do want to highlight that Charlottesville is a little bit of an epicenter of innovation in this regard. If you look at the work that we're doing at Friendship Court, you look at the work that public housing is endeavoring to do with the redevelopment of public housing, and then just south of the city in the county that Habitat is doing in partnership with the residents of Southwood and the redevelopment of a trailer park down there. The confluence of all three of those redevelopments happening at the same time, all prioritizing resident input and design process, is literally unprecedented. There is nowhere else in the country that is doing this kind of work at this scale. So it's a pretty remarkable moment in time. And we are all experimenting to some extent, because I mentioned that there's no real roadmap for this. And we are experimenting not like in a science experiment, but we are experimenting in that we are striving for something extraordinary and no one's done it before. So we are having to figure out on the fly how to do this, and we have to listen to the resident priorities. And so what that means is that the way that we are doing it at Friendship Court is a little different than the way that they are doing it at Southwood, is a little bit different than the way they're doing it at public housing. All of them on some level are imperfect, and all of them on many levels are beautiful. And the beauty sources from the fact that the residents are central to this process. So over the last 3 years, we have dug deep into the design process, and I want to highlight a few of the priorities that have emerged. I referenced this a couple of moments ago, but phasing, it was critical. So in phase one, if you're familiar with the Friendship Court site, that's currently open space in the community. So that will allow us to build there first, and again, I'll show a sequence of that shortly, and then sequence accordingly so we have zero displacement. But the question one of the question points and the balance points was how many phases, and we ended up landing on 4 as the right number of phases that allowed us to maintain zero displacement, have as short a construction time overall, but also to balance all the other priorities that I will discuss here shortly. One of the really key components from the residents' perspective is not just about rebuilding new housing, but that this redevelopment has to be a catalyst for that upward economic mobility that I referred to, the lack of it in the city of Charlottesville. So one of the ideas that arose firmly in the beginning of the process was establishing a high quality early childhood center. And so that will be part of phase one. And there's a deeper story to there, and depending on where we go and the timing and everything else, I might dig into that a little bit. But each phase will have some component of a commercial space or a retail space or a programmatic space that dovetails into how we build opportunities for upward economic mobility for the residents. Another key priority for the residents was a multiplicity of housing types. So we know that I mentioned it earlier, but one of the key priorities from the residents' perspective too is to increase the overall housing on the site. So we will, by the beginning of the plan, beginning right now, we have 150 homes on site, rental homes. By the end of redevelopment through phase 4, we will be close to somewhere around 450 homes. So that's roughly a tripling in density. Because they recognize they want that income integration, the residents want that income integration, and they want that additional affordable housing added. But it had to be in a balanced way. So in this diagram, the red or the orange red there represents stacked townhomes, and the purple represents multifamily buildings, kind of like more traditional multifamily apartment buildings. And we are doing both of those because the residents know that we need to hit a certain level of density, but at the same time, they want to ensure that many of the families who have children have access as much as possible to front doors and back doors where they feel like their kids can go in and out to sidewalks, to playgrounds, et cetera, and do that in a safe way, in ways that they're currently accustomed to because they currently live in townhomes. And I mentioned the income tiering and the income integration. And again, this is a balance, and this is a little bit of an experiment. You know, the balance here that the residents hit upon is that on the one hand, they want to provide the opportunity for income mobility, and by that I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but right now, if you live in a Friendship Court or anywhere in the downtown core and you don't make a whole lot of money, and you want to take, but you do find a better job, or you get a raise, or you get a second job, or whatever it is, and you have the capacity to move into something a little bit more expensive, but still on the affordable side, there's nowhere in the city of Charlottesville you can move to. The next tier step is probably 20 or 30 miles outside the city limits before you can start to afford things, which then, of course, introduces increased transportation costs, disrupts your social network, potentially pulls you away from the employment center, brings your schools to a different school system, incredibly disruptive. So residents of Friendship Court wanted to introduce a way to provide a pathway for increasing income, moving into newer housing, and thereby opening up the more deeply subsidized housing for those who then need it more, but to do that on site. So this income tiering is a part of that equation. So on the one hand, they wanted that as a priority and a balance point. On the other hand, they did not want to overly disrupt their existing community culture. Friendship Court is a community that, like every community, has its flaws, but also has a sense of camaraderie and a sense of people taking care of each other. It is both and the social norms, the cultural context in any sort of redevelopment, any sort of expansion has risk for being compromised. And so the residents have landed on this third idea, where you have a third of the existing Section 8, which is the existing homes, a third additional moderate affordable, and a third restricted market rate, to provide those tiers of affordability, but to be able to still hold on to their sense of culture and identity. And that's part of the experiment. Again, there's no clear precedent that we could point to that says this is the right way to do it. But it's what the residents have landed on, and so we are fully in support of it. So the plan here, I'm not going to dive into too much detail. Again, I think I'm probably running behind on my time. But the point is that we have the 4 phases. We have townhomes and multifamily buildings within each of those phases. We have open space. So this future 1-acre park in the middle will become a future public park that will be at this heart of Friendship Court. So it sort of prioritizes Friendship Court families, but it will be open to the community as a whole. The 4th Street will extend through the site and to kind of reconnect the community to the existing neighborhoods around it. But there will, the street that is this public street here, which is currently the private entry drive into the site, will not be extended all the way through to the Belmont neighborhood, but there will be strong pedestrian connections at each of the public streets, so where the streets connect there on 6th Street, so that people feel a sense of porosity and people can move back and forth between the communities, walking to Clark Elementary, outside folks coming in and occupying the public park and so forth. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. So I talked about phasing, and I know this might be a little bit difficult to read if you're looking at a small screen, but phase 1 will be 106 apartments between the townhomes and multifamily building, 46 families that you see kind of highlighted there of the existing families will move in, which means that the other 60 units will be split roughly evenly between those moderate affordable and the restricted market rate units. Once that move has happened, then those buildings that those 46 families were in can now be torn down, and we build phase 2, again with more open space, with more townhomes and multifamily buildings, and then the 54 families can move in. And then we take down those now empty buildings, build phase 3, those final 50 families move in. And so by the end of phase 3, everyone who currently lives there will be rehoused, which is why, and with a roughly 2-year timeline on every phase. So we don't have overlapping construction, so we can maintain zero displacement. Which leaves phase 4 as a little bit of a question mark. And that's not a giant parking lot. That's not what that gray represents. What that represents is that the work that we've done with the residents in designing their future community, we've prioritized the process of designing phases 1 through 3, because those are the homes they're going to be moving into. That's the part of the space that is absolutely going to be theirs. As we look to what happens in phase 4, there will absolutely be additional affordable housing. There will likely be some additional commercial space or retail space, but we have not designed it yet. I'm going to kind of go through this, I think, a little bit quickly. That this is a little bit more detail on phase one. You can see how in phase one, we are also bringing back, in addition to the new homes, the early childhood centers I mentioned, basketball court, outdoor space. And that was one of the clear priorities from the residents from the very beginning, is that each phase, even though it integrates like puzzle pieces connected to the whole, each phase on some level had to stand alone because this process was sequenced over time. We didn't want to lose open space for more than one phase chunk at a time, if that makes sense. We are also planning on ultimately moving Piedmont Housing Alliance's permanent headquarters down to the second and third floor of above the early childhood center, recognizing that we want to be accountable to the community and that we want to have the ability to have folks come in and walk into our office on a daily basis. So I'm going to go through a couple of just quick renderings to highlight some of what's coming. So there's a quick rendering of some of the stacked townhomes along 6th Street, a quick rendering along Garrett Street, where the entrance to the multifamily building will be. There's a courtyard in the multifamily building. Just off to the left, you can't quite see, but there's that's where the basketball court was going to be, or will be. And then the early childhood center that I mentioned and future offices will be in a building there in between the townhomes and the multifamily building, with also a new community center that will be, because we actually have a current community center that provides after school and adult focused programming on site, and this will be the new relocation of that. So I am going to pause here for a moment, and I'm going to bring up a video from Ms. Houchins. And Ms. Houchins, if you remember all the way back, I can just scroll right back here and do this. If you remember, here's Ms. Houchins on the lower part of the screen as one of the at-large community members on the advisory committee. So Ms. Houchins is a former Friendship Court resident, which you'll hear her speak here shortly. And she has continued to be engaged, and she's kind of the mama bear of Friendship Court. She does an extraordinary job of advocating for, empathizing with, and just loving the community. So I'm gonna switch shortly here and just let her speak her piece. It'll be just a short 3-minute video.
I just go in the community. I park my car.
Well, hello. How are you all?
I play with kids.
What grade you in? Third.
I knock on doors.
Please tell the girls I said hello. I will. Okay.
Because I don't want to forget where I came from. I came from there, right there. I moved in about 1979.
You do not know how many days I've been through this door.
As a mother of 2 children.
Was 16. Was 16B.
I had a son that had some illnesses, what is called sickle cell anemia. You're in and out of the hospital, then one day they're feeling well, and then they can go over into a crisis. Friendship Court offered me what I needed right then. It was just not a place to live, but it was home.
Yeah, I had all these children. Yeah.
Neighbor were neighbors.
Every neighbor. Yeah, every neighbor. Girls, you got the picture. That's Keisha. That's Keisha. No, it's not.
You knew that in their action and not what they just said, but we saw that. I saw that. I wanted my kids to be a part of that.
But let me tell you what, many little boys in my class this year. Yes, ma'am, at Venerable School.
I was at Friendship Court for about 24, 25 years.
Good to see you, darling. Good to see you.
That stability allowed me to take on more responsibility as a homeowner. You can be here, but you can also get here, and then you can get to another level, and you can get to another level. And so that's really what it did for me. It allowed me to grow. And so for the redevelopment, It's not about the buildings, but loving, caring, looking out for one another, pulling one another up, because someone did that for me. We're all one and in this together.
So Ms. Houchins says it better than probably either Charlene or I ever could. She's an amazing woman. I think the last comment I'll make before we transition to the next stage here is that, and I've mentioned this a number of times, but I just want to highlight it, that the roadmap for how to do this work doesn't exist because we lived in a contrived society that we collectively created, that is exclusive for some, exclusionary for some, and privileges others, predominantly based on race. How Friendship Court came to be in the first place is representative of that. And the question of how we live together in a way that we can support each other, we don't know how to do that as a society. That is a challenge. Other than those folks that we, perhaps that look like us and make the same amount of money as us and live in the same exact neighborhood, that is a difficult task for us to overcome, and it requires not just will, but also addressing some of the formal exclusionary pieces that Charlene was referencing in the beginning in her piece. So with that, I'll open it up and hand it back over to you, Robbie, I guess.
For that really informative presentation. I always learn more every time I hear both of you speak, so I appreciate that. So a critical part of the idea behind this series is to provide you with the opportunity to discuss these issues directly with other members of the community. So we will now be sending you into breakout rooms with a few other members of the audience to reflect on the following 2 questions. Please consider any takeaways you'd like to share today as you discuss these questions in your small group, and we'll provide you the opportunity to do so in the chat when we reconvene. So the 2 questions that we want you to think about and share out with your members of your group are the following. What has been your authentic experience living in a community that is integrated culturally or by income? We encourage you to be real about this and not get stuck in the platitudes. What are the conditions or activations that would encourage you and your neighbors to share an expectation for supporting each other? So please be reminded that in order for other members of your breakout to hear and see you, you must enable your video and microphone by clicking the icons in the top left corner of your screen. Please bear with us as it takes just a minute to get you into the chat rooms. And we'll have about 15 minutes for this chat time. All right, I want to welcome everybody back. I hope you enjoyed your breakouts. Please take a moment to share any insights or takeaways from these conversations by typing them into the chat. A reminder that those insights are valuable resources as we continue our work in the space, and any thoughts you share will be saved by our team to help inform future discussions. As you all are sharing, we do only have about 10 to 15 minutes left in today's session, and we would like to provide all of you the opportunity to ask a question that you might have for either Charlene or Sunshine. Please send them to me through the chat function on the right corner of the screen, and I'll surface them as they come in. A reminder that we do have a limited amount of time, so we'll do our best to get to everybody who has a question. So let's take a look and see here. I'm going to try to run through. So sports are good for connecting, as is education centered around gaining career skills and certifications. Maybe a question on wraparound services, Charlene or Sunshine.
So maybe I'll jump into that first. we have as I mentioned, we have an existing community center. That community center provides a space for co-locating partner agency work to provide services on site on a regular basis. Although obviously under COVID, that protocol has changed, and the services we can actually facilitate has changed as well. But as an organization, Piedmont Housing Alliance, we also have a financial and housing counseling team. So we try to regularly provide those services to Friendship Court residents. We added a person to that team dedicated to Friendship Court about 1.5 years ago, who is our economic opportunity coordinator, and she works with families both on terms of seeking new jobs, coaching on how to maybe ask for a pay raise, whatever it might be. But she can also help coordinate other outside resources to bring them in. So there's a decent amount now, but part of the revisioning of the Friendship Court redevelopment is to provide more space and more direct connectivity for other nonprofits on site as well.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Anything else to add to that, Charlene?
Just that in addition to the financial opportunity type of services, we also try to attend to, especially during COVID, the services for folks around who need assistance with food, assistance with maybe getting educational resources to their kids if they have children. So we try to attend as much as possible, given some of our limitations with staffing, but we're wanting to be as responsive as possible.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. We have a question here from Ty Cooper. Is the community garden out, or what will be in that space?
So for those who don't know, that existing open space on the east side of Friendship Court, currently one of its functions is to provide a community garden that's been there for over a decade now, that provides free vegetables for residents, not only within Friendship Court, but actually some of those get distributed to surrounding public housing communities as well. There's no question that the residents are prioritizing the garden coming back. The only lingering question is where exactly and in what sequence. So we think we have a plan for a good portion of the garden to come back in sort of phase 1.5, which is sort of at the edge between phases 1 and 2. We think we can get it in there within a couple of months after the residential buildings in phase 1 are built. But then what I referenced earlier is that 1 acre Central Park. Part of that will likely be dedicated to community garden as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Will the child care center be open for extended hours to accommodate earlier or later shifts? This came from Kristen Miller.
That is a complex answer. So what we are trying to do with the Early Childhood Center, again, is sort of nothing short of extraordinary in the sense that if you look at the data in the state of Virginia, roughly 70% of employment positions at early childhood centers and daycares across the state are essentially poverty level wage jobs. It is an endemic problem in the industry. So what we are trying to do with Friendship Court is to balance a perfect trifecta of providing high quality, not just a daycare space, but a high quality with really focused curriculum. We'll be partnering with UVA and their Stream In 3 curriculum out of the Curry School to partner doing that portion with having a well-paid staff that are decent wages with an opportunity for kind of, again, a career development, while also trying to ensure that we have spaces for folks who can't normally afford early childhood care and might come in with subsidies in one way or another. Balancing all three of those is extraordinarily difficult. That's one of the reasons why we are trying to fundraise for that building in its entirety, so that the Early Childhood Center doesn't have to bear the burden and cost of paying any sort of rent, because that allows us to then take that money and put it towards staffing or towards scholarships for children or whatever the balance turns out to be. So to the question of hours, that is another portion of that like balancing spectrum of how do you ensure you are providing the services that people need while also recognizing that the longer the hours are, the more expensive it is to operate. And then the other part of that balance equation too is, are we offering spaces for? We will be offering spaces from infant to up to pre-kindergarten. And in that spectrum, we know that there is critical need in the infant to 2-year-old. Like there is a dire need across the nation, let alone in Virginia, let alone in Charlottesville, let alone in Friendship Court, for high quality 0 to 2 early childhood support. But that is also the most expensive type of programming to offer in an early childhood center, because the required ratios for its staff to student is much lower, higher, whatever the right. You have less children per teacher. So just it's more effectively expensive. So all of those things will come into play as we balance this out. But the general goal we're aiming for right now is a 6 to 6 operating time frame. But the other part that we have working for us is that there are some currently existing in-home childcare places within Friendship Court that families are operating. Part of our goal over the medium and long term is to help lift them up and give them some of the same training that we are offering to the teachers who are going to be in the early childhood center, so they can improve their programming as well. And that those families are likely better situated to manage different shifts in time that the early childhood center itself can't do. I know that's a long answer, sorry.
Well, it's exciting. That's going to be one of the only centers like it in our community, so I appreciate that. Anything else to add on that, Charlene, or that pretty much answers that question? Okay. 2 items that encourage community building and getting together: walking areas, non-traffic, and gathering building spaces. Any comment on that?
I agree. I'm not sure what else to say on that, and that has certainly been part of the planning process that the residents have been engaged in. Is not just the building themselves, and but it's the units themselves, the apartments or homes, but it's also what happens in the common spaces in the buildings, and then what happens as connecting points for walkways, for health-related issues, for community building. All of those were front and center for the residents as we were going through the design process.
Okay. How much undeveloped land is available in the city of Charlottesville, and how much would be needed to be developed to truly address our housing needs? I'm not sure if either one of you wants to take that one.
I'm not going to. We have a little over 10 square miles in the city of Charlottesville. The need. The determined need per the housing needs assessment that came out about a year and a half ago was that we need somewhere between 3,300 and 4,000 interventions in affordability to address the current situation. I say interventions because that's a combination of things. It's not just new units, but it's also ensuring that those folks who are currently cost burdened in living where they are, or doubled up living where they are, or who are paying far too high property taxes from their fixed incomes, or any number of situations. If we are going to help people be in a situation where they can sustain their in a healthy and viable living condition, we need that somewhere between 3,300 and 4,000 interventions in the city. We don't know exactly, but probably a third of that is new units in the city. But as soon as you draw that line outside the city limits and you pull in the urban ring, and maybe even a little bit further out into Albemarle County, that number grows to close to 10,000. So this has to be a regional conversation. But to get at the question, I think the point of the question is, what sort of density are we talking about? What kind of interventions from a new unit construction side do we need to consider? And the bottom line is that, and this is based on my experience of living in many other cities in the past who have confronted similar challenges, there is no silver bullet solution. The phrase that I've talked about, it's like the kind of the silver shotgun. Like you need every sort of tool in the tool belt being utilized to address affordability, including increased density wherever it's possible. And I do think that one of the questions that each of us should be asking is, in my neighborhood, what is the way in which we can absorb the necessary increase in density that's going to be needed to achieve equity and parity with affordable housing in the community?
Agreed. Good answer. Anything else on that, Charlene? Okay. James Pierce had a question. It might just be an open question. Great presentation from our presenters. Any good resources for starting similar conversations in nearby rural areas? That comes up a lot for all of us, I think.
That's a tough one. I know that, right now, the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission is working with the surrounding largely rural counties for each of those communities to update their current comprehensive plans. And it's, I think for the first time, probably in maybe ever, but certainly in a very long time, when each of those communities is beginning to acknowledge and recognize its own challenge around affordable housing. It's not just the city of Charlottesville anymore. It's not just the urban ring around Albemarle County. And I would say that the TJPDC has been doing as good a job as possible with helping those counties kind of contend with those questions and think through what the implications are for, and the need is for changing zoning and implementing an affordable housing fund and addressing things that get in the way of affordable housing currently. So I would say that connecting with the TJPDC is a great first step. Charlene?
And I would just add that just making sure there's a really clear understanding of what has happened or not has happened in the past, so that you're not repeating some of the inefficiency, the missed opportunities to really be in a place to affect change. Otherwise, you're just perpetuating the stuff that's already there.
Yeah.
Feedback. We'll take one or two last questions. Adrian Den, do you have confidence in the process toward new comprehensive plan, especially with regard to achieving equity?
So what Adrian is referring to is that Charlottesville is currently in the process of, updating its current comprehensive plan, but we are actually in Charlottesville at a pretty remarkable moment because the consultant that was brought in to work on the comprehensive plan is working on sort of a sequence, a three-tiered sequence of work for the city. The first portion is actually working right now on developing a strategic housing plan for the city, which essentially looks at what our goals are for addressing affordable housing, identifies the tools, and then so we can develop a pathway towards achieving success. There are cities across the country who have gone through and developed plans like that then effectively sit on the shelf because their comprehensive plan and their zoning haven't changed, and they just get in the way and stop any sort of forward momentum other than sort of piecemeal. Because as I said before, there's no way to do this without being holistic and comprehensive in the effort. It will not change otherwise. Bar none, it will not. We have to be thinking holistically. So the fact that we have a consultant on board who's going to be helping us develop that strategic housing plan, then leading that into them helping us write the portions of the comprehensive plan related to housing. And then they are also, their contract extends to helping us rewrite our zoning code. I'm not aware of any other city in the country that has actually lined those up 1, 2, 3 to enable the vision, the framework, and then the structure that's going to help us achieve success. And in and of itself, that still will be insufficient. There will still have to be money be put on the table. There will still have some detailing of some of those programs. But we are actually in a pretty extraordinary position to do more than almost any other city because we have that sequence lined up. So I remain very hopeful. The question was, do I have confidence?
Confidence.
This is an incredibly complex conundrum that no city, no county anywhere has ever solved. Not to put too fine a point on it. And I have confidence we'll make progress. I think we have the opportunity to do something extraordinary, but it will take concerted, focused, persistent effort and pushing on all of our parts to make it, to achieve it.
Thank you for that, Sunshine. Okay. So we'll do one last question here. How does the taking of Gospel Hill by UVA impact access to healthcare today, especially for people of color?
Well, that's a pretty tiered question in terms of, you know, first you're taking away the space, which takes away the number of folks who potentially could have access to nearby healthcare, because then those people are pushed out of the community, and that means they have to find healthcare somewhere else. And their relatives, generationally, they have to find healthcare somewhere else. In addition to employment, because some of those folks who lived in Gospel Hill were also employed by the hospital. Today, you're talking about access to healthcare that, you know, doesn't just impact folks who are in proximity to that hospital. It's just with all of the other things that we've been pointing out before, with lack of an adequate job, which affects their stability, their housing stability, which then puts people in a position to get in that survival mode. And maybe healthcare isn't at the top of their list in terms of trying to pay rent or pay the light bill or pay the gas bill. And so there are definitely some indirect and direct implications, but it's much bigger than just UVA taking over a neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. If you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to myself at United Way or Caroline Emerson. Both of our information's on our website, or TomTom as well. We thank you for being here today and sharing with each other, asking some really important questions, and hopefully the takeaways will inform how you live in this community, the way you vote, and the kind of decisions you make. If what we discussed today resonated with you, we remind that you can make a donation as part of the United Way's COVID Recovery and Resiliency Fund that supports local families struggling with the exact kinds of inequities that the series highlights and explores. And we also would love to see you next week. We've got another 4 programs in our series. Next, we'll be on health equity issues and solutions with Dr. Michael Williams. He's Associate Chief Medical Officer for Clinical Integration and Associate Professor of Surgery at UVA Health Systems. I will tell you, in talking to him the other day in planning for that conversation, he mentioned he had just talked to Jim Ryan that morning about what are they going to do when the students come back and COVID potentially becomes an issue. What if we have an outbreak? We have 30 beds that are already in use as we speak, and how do they make decisions about who they serve in the community? Students, people working on the front lines, people most impacted. So we have a really interesting conversation around equity and health as it relates to our community right now and COVID. So we hope you'll join us. Thanks again for being here. Thank you, Sunshine and Charlene, for your incredible work and insight and passion. We appreciate you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.